So welcome everybody to our podcast series, Leading in a Climate Changed World. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Sandy Ibrahim. Sandy is part poet, part rabble-rousing mystic. She's a Canadian of Egyptian and German descent, and she sometimes says she doesn't know if her grandmothers are cheering her on or rolling over in their graves. After leaving her childhood home at 17, she's been pursuing sovereignty while maintaining a state of reverent bewilderment. She lives in Victoria, BC with her husband. She's about to launch her youngest son into the world. And Sandy's life and work explores themes of leadership, including aspects like sovereignty, sacrifice, maturity, purpose, empathy. She often turns to myth to break away from solutions thinking, and like the goddess Inanna, who I think we will hear more about during the interview, we may collectively be taking a descent into the underworld, a place of chaos, destruction, and resurrection, or at the very least, we are in a liminal space betwixt and between. Either way, she would say we've left the ordinary world and are living with dark uncertainty. And just as seeds sprout in the dark, this could be an alchemical time. Leadership for Sandy includes cultivating empathy for the shame, grief, confusion, anxiety, and despair that comes with seeing our complicity in destroying our world. She believes that a willingness to tell the truth about our lives serves as a strong catalyst for creation and could spur a transformation that weaves us back into belonging to Earth. So Sandy, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And maybe we could pick up on this part at the end where we talk, at the end of the introduction, where I said, you think that a willingness to tell the truth about our lives can also be part of what catalyzes shifts that are needed. And maybe you could just tell us a bit about your life and kind of what brought you into this field of concern.
Yeah, I think when I was a little girl, I understood that we were a little off track, that there was a couple of things going on, that I was having two separate experiences of the world, one in nature and one at home. And to me, real life was happening outside in my backyard, and I was really connected to all of the elements. And I would have these magical experiences, or things that really felt magical, and then I'd go inside and I'd kind of want to talk about them, but I knew I didn't have any language around it.
What sort of magical experiences would you be wanting to talk about?
I think the feeling of connection and belonging. It wasn't anything otherworldly. It was very earthly, worldly. It was very tangible and real, and it was being dismissed as relevant in my house and at school, everywhere. And so I started grasping for language around the kind of experiences that I was having. I turned to religion. I had a friend who was Mormon, and I thought maybe she had it, because I knew that what I was experiencing wasn't being talked about. And it, I guess some of if I can try to find some language about it, I felt like I was in relationship with my environment, and that my environment was aware of me. So the wind and I had a connection, and I could kind of sense how the wind would connect me to the trees, to even to the roots. I could almost hear the ground stretch with the roots breaking through. There was just a real intimacy that I felt. And it was real. I knew it. But like I said, it was so dismissed. So I could feel the schism that was going on as a young girl. And then just gradually I abandoned my relationship with nature, so that way I could find my place in society. But it was always there, like this ache, a kind of silent ache. And I ended up working as a computer programmer when I was in my early 20s, and suffered a panic attack one day that sent me into a doctor's office, and I was eventually put on medication and for depression. And the doctor told me that I was too sensitive to read the news, because it was partly spurred on by something I had seen about the polar bears. So this would have been about 25 years ago. So I, jokingly say that the doctor's cure for that was a lifetime of denial and some Prozac. And then life got busy. I ended up getting married, and I had 2 children, and they brought me immense amount of joy. And I, threw myself into motherhood and loved pretty much every moment of it. And it brought me back into that kind of connection that I felt as a young girl. And I was consumed with motherhood and kind of shut out in a way what was going on in the world. And began to see myself as a kind of a passive observer, maybe one of the good guys in a broken world, but not really recognizing that I had any part of it. So in about 3 years ago, I started waking up to just how dire the situation was in terms of the climate crisis that we are in. And through the grief and the shame, I stayed with the problem and was able to see how I was directly connected to it through my own life. Not that I am trying to take on all of the problems of the world as one individual, but I recognize that I, as an individual, was the world. I was a small part of the world, and I was, in fact, contributing to the problem or the disconnection, well, however we want to phrase this. So that's kind of how it started for me.
Right, thank you very much. And I want to pick up on something you said earlier when you said, because I think this is really at the root of the challenge. You said I had to leave some of my connection with the environment in order to take my place in society. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about how, also now you work with myths and stories and poetry and other ways of kind of engaging with this topic, but how can we be in society and connected? Why, or do you feel like there still needs to be a choice somehow? Or how do we stay connected while we function in the world and have jobs and travel and do all the things that we need to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's on top. It is for me the question of the times. How can we stay connected to nature when society is destroying it? Is another way of putting that. I think we have to create a bridge back, and maybe there is I wrote to you, I think, a little bit about the idea that I feel like we can't really be good people right now, and that we have such a strong desire to be good. And, perhaps what our definition of good is revolves around how successful we are in society, how welcomed we are, what our sense of belonging is. But when our society is fundamentally sick, which it is right now, and our goodness, our idea of goodness then kind of collapses in on itself. So I don't think that we can be collectively good or objectively good right now. And
but say more about that, because that's quite a provocative statement, that we can't be now. So if somebody's saying, well, I'm doing my best and I'm composting and I'm sold my car and I don't fly anymore and I'm compassionate to my neighbors and I have an allotment where I grow my food, you'd say we still can't be good? Or what does it mean when you say we can't be good?
Yeah, well, I'm still trying to figure out what I mean by this. But first of all, I think that our identities and our sense of safety as individuals revolves a lot around the idea that we may be good people. And maybe what I'm suggesting is it's irrelevant. whether we're good or not is irrelevant. And I've been hearing that term virtue signaling a lot lately. Where people are virtue signaling.
Virtue signaling.
It's just kind of one of the terms that gets thrown out there. So that way, I can appear like I'm good. I can appear like I'm caring and I'm part of the solution. But destruction is woven into the very fabric of our day-to-day lives. So if we were to, put our behavior on a scale, no matter how well-intentioned we are, every individual in the Western world is causing immense amount of harm. So that's the reality. So maybe we should just get over the idea of being good and accept that we're not, and that we can continue moving forward anyway. That doesn't answer your question about how to hold both society and nature, and our relationship to both. Maybe I am saying that we can't. If we want to be good in society, if we want that, the way that business as usual right now is, and we want to have a strong connection to nature, well, we're not going to be able to. Because how can we be intimate with what we're destroying?
Right, and I guess it's also a question about whether we see nature or the environment as something out there that we kind of build a bridge to, or you said earlier, I am the earth. Like, it's not like the earth is out there and it's something that I have a relationship to. If I identify myself more with that, that'll bring forth different sorts of actions.
Yeah.
Would you say that?
I would say that. Yeah. And then the bravery is, well, then how do we reestablish our connection with ourself, I guess, is what you might be leading us to here as Earth. And in order to do that, we have to tell the truth about our lives, which is what I was saying before, and admit that we are suffering as individuals, and that we're hurting, and that our lives are unmanageable.
Right. So there's something about radical honesty in that. Really looking at the truth of our lives, what we feel, what we inflict, what's happening, really looking at that full on. Yeah.
And, in every aspect of our lives, like looking at our relationships, our marriages, our consumption habits, how we're trying to squeeze ourselves into boxes in order to succeed, even looking at leadership as something that's outside of us. We need a fundamental transformation of the way that we view ourselves in this world. And that's going to take an immense amount of courage and truth telling, and a dissent, like Inanna took, where we strip away all of the concepts that we have about ourselves and look at them and face that and swim in unknowingness for a while.
Right. So for people in our audience who maybe don't know the story of Inanna, could you give us a kind of 5-minute synopsis of what that tells us, and why you also feel it's a relevant myth for our time?
Yeah, I love this myth so much. So it was a story that was told in Sumeria about 5,000 years ago. And Inanna was a goddess that was, famous in Mesopotamia. She, for a couple of reasons, the first being that she brought civilization to mankind. She tricked one of her fathers, she had many fathers, into giving up the tools of civilization, and then she brought them to mankind. She had a love affair for mankind, for men specifically. And she was very beautiful, and she was very sexual and powerful. She was the goddess of both heaven and earth. And she had a sister, a Rishkagel, who lived and ruled the underworld. And they were separated, of course. In even to today, I think in myths, the underworld isn't a place that you can come back from. So Inanna never got to see her sister, Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal's husband died. And so Inanna decided that she wanted to go down and help Ereshkigal with the funeral arrangements. Although some people say that she went down there as a power grab for Ereshkigal's territory. But regardless, she went. And she asked the sky gods to help her if she couldn't return, because she couldn't return. That was one of the rules of the underworld. And the sky gods forbade it and said no one should ever crave the underworld. They saw it as a place of depravity and kind of the composting for the human soul. And, there was nothing measurably good about the underworld. It was an unseen territory, and they saw no value of it. The sky gods, of course, were mathematicians and architects and logical, and favored that over the messiness and the death of the underworld. So Inanna went down anyway, and she dressed up in all of her royal greatness, and with her very best friend Nunshabar, she knocked on the door of the underworld. And she was accepted in and had to go through 7 gates before she could see her sister Ereshkigal. And at each one, she had to strip something off of her. Just as an aside, Nunshabar stayed on Earth and how do you say it? She was beating the drum for Inanna, and would do so for 3 days. And after 3 days, if Inanna hadn't returned, Nunshabar was going to go and find help. So Inanna goes down into the underworld, and she strips all of her royal regalia. She takes off her crown. She takes off her chest plate. One by one, she strips down and becomes quite, humiliated, and she's outraged in the process. And when she finally sees Ereshkigal, with one look, kills her. And she is sentenced to death because of her hubris. So 3 days pass, and Nunshabar ends up getting help, and these little beings come down, and Inanna's on a meat hook, and these beings come down, but they first tend to Ereshkigal, who's in an amazing amount of pain. She's suffering from the grief of losing her husband and also of killing her sister, and she's just in immense amount of pain. And so these beings, they come to Ereshkigal first, and Ereshkigal is screaming, and she's like, "Oh, my kidneys, oh, my kidneys." And these little beings say, "Oh, your kidneys, oh, your kidneys." And every pain that Ereshkigal reveals, they reflect. And in this reflection, in this empathetic reflection, Ereshkigal softens, and all of her pain is removed. And she says, "Well, what can I do for you?" And they point to Inanna, and they say, "We want her." And she says, "Oh, okay, she's your queen. I understand." So they breathe life back into Inanna, and Inanna takes makes the ascent back up to Earth. But an exchange has to take place, because no one can leave the underworld. That is the rule. So a deal's made where someone can replace Inanna. So she goes off, and long story short, she finds her husband having a great party, prostitutes on his knees. And she says, "You are going to go into the underworld." And then his name is Dumuzi, and Dumuzi's sister stands in front of him and says, "No, no, no, don't take him. He's a good man. He's a good man." And so they decide that they'll split the time. So 6 months of the year, Dumuzi goes down. 6 months of the time, his sister goes down. And that's the end of the story. Jungians have been studying this myth for, ever since it was revealed, probably in the 1920s, or 1950s, I guess, is when the Jungians would have taken it. But they see it as a map into our unconscious. And then feminists have taken the story, and they see it as a warning of the sign of patriarchy.
Right. So I want to ask you what you're doing with the story around the climate emergency. Like, how do you feel it relates? It's a very strong story. Thank you so much for telling it. And I can feel its relevance also, but I'd love to hear your take on it, and why
Yeah, how I'm flushing it out.
yeah, why is it a myth of our time that would support us in looking and understanding what's happening around the climate emergency?
Well, I think it is a warning of the times to come. I think that Inanna, we're living in the consequence of many of the decisions that were made back in Mesopotamia and Samaria, right? They set the foundations of what we're doing today in many ways: taxes, trade, the beginnings of civilization. They learned to grow their crops by irrigation, and then their climate changed because they didn't realize that they were irrigating their crops with salinated water, and so it folded. And so there's a lot of similarities. They were a war. There was war everywhere in Samaria, and very violent culture, and the patriarchy was rising at that time. Inanna's descent is also the descent of the feminine principle, because during that time Inanna was very famous, and then as she moved, as different civilizations took over that land, she became different goddesses: Ishtar, and then Isis, and Athena, and she just kind of disappeared from relevancy. So that's one thing, and I think that that's relevant to climate change, because the lack of feminine principles in governance and in leadership is partly responsible for destroying our climate.
If you were just to pause you there for a moment, if you were to unpack that, what does that mean when you say lack of feminine principles in governance? What kind of practices or principles would you see if there was more of the feminine present?
I think that women are very tied to the earth. We're earthbound by nature's design. We live in cycles. We feel those in our bodies. We breathe them. It's very hard, I think, for women to perform in the same way every single day, 365 days a year. We understand that there's times that we need to rest. Our body dictates that. And rather than seeing that as a strength or as wisdom, it's been considered to be a weakness and a lack of ability to perform, right? I'm talking, of course, about our menstrual cycle, for one. Motherhood also will, take us into a different realm. The ability to give life through our own bodies is, very much an aspect of Earth. So, we feed our children from our own bodies, just like Earth feeds all of its children from her body. So we have an innate physical understanding of the rules of nature, because they're in our cells. And I'm not suggesting that men don't, but it's obviously out of whack. There's no balance that's here. So feminine leadership in the true way that women would lead, which might be, okay, let's take a break for 2 weeks and miss the deadline because we don't have the answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. But I noticed that you're also talking about women, and my understanding of the feminine is that it's different from women. So I, as a male, for example, have some feminine aspects to my nature, which can be amplified or not, and patriarchy for sure, and all the conditioning that I grow, it amplifies more the masculine. But I wonder, so I totally understand and support what you're saying around women's innate connection to earth and to nature, to the environment, in a way that I, as a man, do not experience, for example. But as a man, I could also exhibit feminine principles of leadership. Would you agree with that?
I would. Yeah. And how would you see yourself doing that?
With some of what I would consider more kind of feminine aspects of myself. So fluidity, emergence, sensitivity, compassion, care, as opposed to a kind of more masculine paradigm of kind of order, power, logic, analysis, drive, the different kind of qualities, yin yang, we might say, qualities. Animus, animal, different cultures will language it differently, but I have both of these in me.
Yes.
And part of my understanding of what's needed now is that we need to amplify the feminine, both in men and in women.
Yes. Yes. Here, here. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, I mean, the feminine has been oppressed in both of us.
Right, right. So if we build a bit on what you shared about the legend of Inanna, and also your work around some of the qualities I mentioned in the intro around you, like sovereignty and sacrifice. How do you work with these qualities? Because these are also, I want to bring it a little bit more now to leadership. So these are qualities that you feel are important in leadership at the moment. And do you draw them from that legend, or you draw them from your experience of life, or where's the focus on these particular?
Yeah, both. I mean, back to Inanna, it's you know, I've studied the myth for years now, and it's not necessarily self-evident again how her descent would relate to what's going on, but back to her descent and what it was that she was sacrificing. It was a self-concept of who she was and how she was to gain power. So Inanna had a you know, a fairly, I guess, masculine sense of how she was going to gain power. And it was during that descent, when she was stripped away from it all, that and then tried for hubris. And that word more than anything is what stands out for me. And the death because of hubris. That hubris was the great crime that Inanna committed, and it was so great that she, you know, the goddess of heaven and earth, would die for that. I think that's so relevant to what we're doing right now. You know, in the climate conversations, I can see the different pulls for narrative about how we're going to talk about this. And even within it, it's hubris. Even with the climate champions of the world, there's still hubris in terms of we think that we know what's going on here, and we don't know what's going on. So you know, I believe the science of climate change, don't get me wrong, I believe it. But I knew it when I was 7 years old that something was wrong without seeing any science. So focusing purely on the science of climate change is hubris. It once again puts our own knowledge before the knowledge of the earth and and life itself. And creates that separation. There's something happening right now, and we are deeply complicit in the destruction of our world. There's no question about that. But something is emerging. You know, maybe it will include us, and maybe it won't. But we can't solve this problem. And even using the language of solving the problem of climate change, I think, you know, points to the hubris of humanity. I think the invitation that Inanna got was to relinquish the control, in a sense, and set down her ideas about who she was, her fanciful ideas about who she was, and let the compost just eat those identifications away until she was just left with the elements, and then, you know, reborn. And able, with humility, with a sense of place, and you know, resume her position of authority, because we do have authority in this world, and that's, you know, through our sovereignty.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to come to. Maybe you could speak a bit about your understanding of sovereignty, and also where you see it. If we also now kind of zoom out a little bit into what you see in the world. Firstly, what is your understanding of sovereignty, and do you see it anywhere? Do you see it in leaders anywhere? Do you see it in manifesting anywhere? What is your experience of sovereignty also?
Yeah, well, I just love the word sovereignty. First of all, it remains an immense riddle to me, and it pulls me in. I've spent the last 4 years in really in deep inquiry about the word, thinking that I knew what it was. So when I first started thinking about the word sovereignty, I thought that it meant that I could do what I wanted. that I had full agency about my life. And I don't feel that now. You asked, do I see any leaders that have sovereignty? I look to nature now, and I see sovereignty everywhere in nature, but I don't really see it in humanity yet. And now the definition that I have of sovereignty is, it's not a definition, but kind of a feeling of understanding of the word is more that it is to be who and what we are. It's almost an elemental, requirement for life. That which is needs to be what it is. And if it isn't able to be what it is, it lacks sovereignty. So, a rose is a rose, and there's conditions for sovereignty. There's the rose will always be the rose. It may be a dying rose, it may be a thriving rose, and there's conditions to support its growth, like there are in us. But I don't believe that humans are sovereign. I don't think we know who and what we are in terms of what life has been asking of us. So I think that there's this, I didn't realize this until well into my inquiry after I read Sharon Blackie's book, If Women Rose Rooted. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
It's a fantastic book.
So maybe you could talk to us a bit about your understanding of what sovereignty is and how you see it appearing or not appearing in the world.
So I've been thinking about sovereignty for many years. And when I first started working with the word, I thought that it was pointing to authority or agency of an individual. And I had images in my head of, like women with a sword. I even have that on my website, it was a strength that I would be able to exhibit in the world. And as I sat with the inquiry, it seemed to me that it was more of a submission into who I already am than some kind of fabrication of who I could be. And I started looking into nature and asked myself things like, well, is the rose sovereign? Is my dog sovereign? Is that tree sovereign? And began to see it as a property of life. Sovereignty is a property of life. It's necessary to life. That the thing that is has to be what it is. And to me, that's what sovereignty ultimately means, is the agency to be who you are. And I think that that's lacking in human society.
Right.
All over the place.
Would you say some of the great leaders that we might sometimes refer to, like Nelson Mandela, for example, would you say that somebody like him has a sense of sovereignty?
Yes, absolutely. And I did start thinking, I was wondering which people out there I thought had sovereignty. And oftentimes they were the people who had, I didn't see sovereignty in myself. And this was disturbing to me because I'm a woman who has a lot of privilege. I live in I'm well fed, I'm well looked after. I can have avocado on my toast and coffee every morning. So I thought, well, surely I must be sovereignty. So I must be sovereign. That I thought that sovereignty might be attached to the ability to make a lot of choice in your life. That the more choices you had, the less restricted you had, the more freedom that you had, the more sovereign you were. And then I really considered people who I thought were sovereign. Nelson Mandela was one who came up right away for me. I saw him as sovereign. And
who else?
Well, Oprah Winfrey I saw as sovereign, immediately just out of the gates. And, Greta Thunberg now, I mean, there's an example of sovereignty, and then there's countless number of people that are sovereign that will never see the headlines. And they're not necessarily the most privileged among us. In fact, I started seeing an inverse relationship between sovereignty and privilege, that the more privilege that we have, potentially the less sovereign we're going to be, because we don't want to risk losing what we think we have in order to come out as who we are, which may not be accepted. And, you know, and I felt that myself, that as I started speaking more about the climate crisis, I started losing some friends. Mm-hmm. I started losing some of the comfort that I had in my life. But I want to get back to Sharon Blackie's book for a second. She wrote a book called If Women Rose Rooted, and she talked about the goddess of sovereignty, who is a goddess that lives in Ireland, who lived in Ireland. And it turns out that sovereignty was the goddess of the land. So she would go into covenant with the king or whoever was ruling and would make an agreement that if the rulers looked after her and the people of the land, then she would continue to provide support to the kingdom. If that covenant was broken, all hell would break loose. And she would come back in floods and kind of reassert her own dominance, which I think we're seeing right now.
Oh, that's beautiful. And we, as you know, we work with a palette of 10 archetypes in the mythodrama business, and one of them is the sovereign. And I think for us, it's a little bit similar, I think, to what you're saying. It's about receiving and radiating a sense of purpose into the world. Willing to take the stage and or at least willing to stand for our beliefs and to radiate that into the world.
And the more that I think about sovereignty, the more I see it as a sacred covenant between me, an expression of life, and life itself that has brought this expression forward. And Inanna, who was hung for her hubris, I think forgot about that. And she thought that she alone was powerful. But we're nothing without life's intelligence breathing and animating us.
Right, and then there's also this beautiful description you gave us earlier about Inanna going through 7 levels of stripping away, stripping away, stripping away, stripping away. And I guess that's something that we also need to ask of leadership now, that they strip away all the artifacts, all the practices, all the ways of not being authentic.
Yeah.
To something very core. And in your terminology, I think maybe that's about maturity. Like one of the words that you also explore is maturity. What does maturity in leadership look like for you?
I think it points to upholding the highest truth of the situation. You know, there's so many systems right now that are broken, and we can support those broken systems, you know, because the stakeholders, whoever they are, want us to, you know, keep things the way they are. So leadership now is to move, I think, beyond, you know, is to really maybe reframe the question, who are the stakeholders? I was thinking about that this morning, that, you know, the stakeholders for me are my great-great-grandchildren. They're the unseen. They're who are going to come after this. Those are the real stakeholders here. My children are the real stakeholders. So, you know, upholding that duty to the future of the planet, that's who we're responsible to. And that means healthy society and healthy community and healthy systems in place. And right now they're not. So, you know, anyone who's in a leadership position right now, if they were to really bring their maturity into it, they'd start challenging what the practices that are going on at all levels. And yeah, it's risky.
Right, it's definitely risky. And you also talk about the notion of sacrifice. So I'm wondering if there's more you want to say about sacrifice. One of the core themes of leadership at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think about, I'm sure you know Charles Eisenstein's work.
Yes.
And one of the things that he frequently talks about that I just think is so powerful is that we can't serve more than one master. So in the case of leadership, who are we serving? And I think it's really important to get clear on who that is. You know, it kind of reflects back to what I was saying before. For me, the stakeholders are those that are yet to come. We need to sacrifice some of our masters or our allegiance to them, especially if there's contradictory motivations there. Because if there are, then we're going to be ineffective as leaders. You know, Inanna had to sacrifice her ego. She had to sacrifice her sense of what a leader looked like, what her sense of being a queen was, right? The first thing she put down was her crown, which was very much about her identity. You know, so maybe, you know, one of the things that leaders have to sacrifice is the idea that they know what to do. Maybe they need to sacrifice that they're even leaders.
Yeah, in order to serve something bigger.
Yes.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really enjoy this conversation a lot. It feels like it takes us into very kind of deep territory. And, you know, I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to say about leadership. We've highlighted 5, I think, qualities of leadership: sovereignty, sacrifice, maturity, purpose, empathy. I don't know if there's other qualities you think are needed in leadership. That's one question. And maybe a closing question is really around, are you hopeful?
I think anyone who's deeply engaged in the climate crisis laughs at the word hope. It's become as irrelevant to me as the word good. I'm highly engaged. I'm very curious. I have a deep reverence for the intelligence of life, and am enormously grateful for the opportunity to experience this. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, totally. No, I kind of ask it with a little bit tongue in cheek in a way, because I also know that hope is such a kind of broad, and, you know, different people have different ways of being with it. But I guess what I'm wanting to invite you to share at the end of this interview is where you see, or do you see anywhere, things that really encourage you, support you, you feel like that's great, this is good, I'm happy this is happening. Like what are the things that you would bring forward to feel like, yeah, these are the seeds of the new?
Yeah, well, for instance, this conversation brings me hope that somebody, you know, like me, you know, who as a 7-year-old girl thought that I was kind of a freak for having an intimate relationship with nature, that now I'm asked to speak about leadership, that brings me hope. I guess, you know, I don't necessarily have hope in terms of any fixed outcome of humanity and how this is all going to turn out. I think we're in for a very, very wild ride. But I do have hope for healing. We may still die. We are dying. I mean, that's going to happen. But we may heal. And then I do want to talk just a little bit about leadership. And if I could leave with anything, that the thing that I've really discovered the most is that we are all leaders right now. And I don't mean to kind of whitewash that or you know, give everybody a gold medal or that kind of thinking, but we are all active participants in our lives. There is, you know, I think seeing what's going on in world leadership right now, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I think that was the moment when I understood that I had to be a leader. Our leaders are obviously failing us. So, you know, this separation that, oh, well, some people are going to lead and some people are going to follow. And if we have good leaders, then we're all going to be in good hands. I don't think that's true. That's a myth. We're all here as unique manifestations of life. And as just by the very fact of our existence puts us into a position of leadership. At the very least, we need to lead ourselves in our little tiny lives forward. So I don't think it's something that is left for the chosen few. It's up to all of us now.
Right, and maybe those are great words to close with. It's up to all of us now. It's not something that we leave to the chosen few. And thank you so much for this time, and thank you for all that you're writing and thinking about and performing and sharing in different mediums. And we will definitely be posting your kind of website and some of your articles, I think, when we put up the interview. So thank you so much, Sandy, for your time. It's been great to talk
Okay.
to you. I feel enriched by this legend of Inanna that's kind of working its way into my psyche as we talk.
Oh,
So,
that's wonderful. Thank you, Robin.
thank you too.